Pokémon Legends Z-A is named after the in-universe Pokémon trainer ranking system where your player starts at rank Z and ascends to rank A. There's this part in the game where you're at rank V, and then all of a sudden you win a battle and you just skip all the way to rank F. Wait, what? That skips 15 letters, by the way. This strange gameplay decision has got me really thinking about how Legends Z-A is structured compared to previous Pokémon games, especially in regards to exploration and game progression. So let's take a look at the structure of early Pokémon games, how it changed over the years, and how Z-A is different from all of it. Chapter 1. Exploration in 2D Pokémon. So Pokémon has always been a pretty linear game in terms of its structure. The structure usually revolves around the badge system, where the player goes through the game defeating 8 specific in-game bosses called gym leaders, who give out gym badges that unlock the next part of the game, either through allowing the use of a move outside of battle that makes you able to move past certain roadblocks, or just outright having a guy in front of the next route who was blocking your way just kind of let you through. Funnily enough, Kanto of Generation 1 was actually the least linear Pokémon region, at least in the 2D games, and Johto of Generation 2 had some non-linearity as well, and this is often seen as a design flaw, especially in Johto. The Hoenn, Sinnoh, and Unova regions of later generations were much more linear, and they were better off for it. So when we think of game progression, the first thing that comes to mind is usually the physical journey. You know, getting from Pallet Town to the Pokémon League. But that's only one half of Pokémon's game progression. The other half is the progression of your Pokémon team themselves, represented through the leveling system. In a more linear region like Sinnoh, the levels of your Pokémon, Wild Pokémon, and Trainer Pokémon are consistent with whichever location the game expects you to be at. With the way stats and levels work in Pokémon, if you're too underleveled, a fight is downright impossible. If you're too overleveled, the fight is trivial. These linear structures make it so that the player ends up with the right level Pokémon at the right time. If there's ever a point in a Pokémon game where you find yourself grinding, it means that this system has failed, and it has never failed worse than in Johto. Look, I love Johto. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are actually probably my favorite Pokémon games because of, well, exploration. But my goodness, look at the difference between the Jasmine gym battle and the Price gym battle. Highest level Pokemon 35 and 34 respectively. You could fight these gym leaders in either order, but in order to fight Jasmine, you have to go through the Lighthouse dungeon with lots of trainers, and you'll probably feel encouraged to defeat gym leader Chuck along the way, since it wouldn't be too easy to get back to Cianwood City without Fly, and guess which gym leader gives you Fly? To defeat Price, you have to get the Red Gyarados and go through the Rocket Hideout. So no matter which way you go, you're going to find yourself more overleveled by the time you get to one of these two gym leaders. A little bit of extra exploration and player freedom was just not worth this blemish on Johto's game progression, and it would have been better off if the game simply railroaded you to fight Jasmine before Price and leveled their teams accordingly. However, even though Pokemon games are definitely better off being linear, that doesn't mean that these linear games lack exploration. But if a game is linear, how can you explore it? One way that Pokemon games succeed at exploration is adding a bunch of small areas that are just slightly off the beaten path for the player to take a break during their regularly scheduled journey. A great example of this is the Ruins of Alph in Johto. The Ruins of Alph is not required to beat the game. You could completely skip the entire place and still become champion. But the existence of the Ruins of Alph adds something to the player experience by giving you a sense of discovery when you visit. This is accomplished not only by just being a unique location for the player to find, but by giving the player a self-contained purpose within it. The Ruins of Alph is home to a Pokemon named Unknown. Now, as a Pokemon, Unknown is, well, completely useless because it only learns one attack. But because Unknown has a different form for every letter of the alphabet, and in the remakes at least, if you collect all 26 forms, you get access to the 2 secret forms, the exclamation point and the question mark. Add in on top of that a few items to pick up and other Pokemon to encounter, and you've got yourself an area that makes the player feel like a real explorer. But not every area has to specifically include special side content or a full-on quest. Sometimes all an optional area needs to do is offer the player a unique place to visit and a Pokemon you can't get elsewhere that you could add to your team. Take, for example, the Old Chateau from Sinnoh. At this point in the game, this is the only place you can get a hold of Ghastly, which would make it the earliest place to get a Ghost-type Pokemon, unless you're playing Pearl, where you could also catch Misdreavus a little earlier. Since you're still in the early game, the high presence of Normal-type moves could make a Ghost-type like Ghastly quite an advantageous team member, and by having it be the only Pokemon that appears in the Old Chateau that you went out of your way to get to, you may be more encouraged to have it on your team. The Old Chateau is also home to Rotom, a Pokemon that I thought was a legendary for the longest time, but I already talked about that in a previous video, link in the description by the way. But even though Rotom is not a legendary, its encounter was still unique to the Old Chateau and acted as a reward for exploration. The Old Chateau is also home to an item called the Old Gateau. What the heck is a Gateau anyway? This item is functionally identical to a full heal, but in the Sinnoh games, you only get one per game right here. When I played through Sinnoh, I could never bring myself to use my Old Gateau, no matter how poisoned my Pokemon was. It's just such a sentimental item to me, and it's a reminder that I went out of my way to explore the region. They didn't have to add this item. It could have just been a full heal on the ground, but because they did, the exploration ended up being all the more memorable. Another item of note you get in the Old Chateau is the Dread Plate, one of the many Arceus plates that power up certain types of attacks. In Sinnoh, the plates feel a lot like a marker of exploration, as most of these kinds of places give you one of the plates. And of course, I can't talk about the Old Chateau without talking about the Chateau ghosts. They really scared me when I was a kid because I found them without knowing that they existed. I thought my game was haunted. Sometimes when you walk into these rooms in the Old Chateau, you can see a little girl or an old man who walk away without a walking animation, almost like they're floating. While they serve no broader gameplay purpose, they add to the overall vibe of the Old Chateau and help enhance the gameplay reasons you went there. But while there are lots of places you can go out of your way to explore during your main Pokemon adventure back in these 2D games, the amount of exploration absolutely explodes in number once you reach the postgame. In the postgame, you no longer have a specific linear goal, well, except Johto's postgame, and the region becomes a playground for player exploration and Pokemon capturing. A Pokemon postgame will usually give the player a brand new area to explore, as well as open up some new dungeons near the previous areas we're familiar with. And of course, lots and lots of legendary Pokemon to find. Gen 1 Kanto and Hoenn are the only regions in the 2D era that pretty much entirely neglect to add a whole new area. And while I can give Gen 1 Kanto a pass for this because it was the very first game, it will always disappoint me how little post-game Hoenn has. The Battle Frontier in Emerald was definitely an improvement, and it's truly baffling the concept still hasn't returned since Generation 4, but while the Battle Frontier expands the amount of battles you can do, it doesn't scratch that exploration itch. One thing that Pokemon games always screw up in regards to post-game exploration is tying it into level progression. Usually, the champion has Pokemon that are around level 60, but then post-game trainers will never have Pokemon that are even as close to as strong as the champion, so they all end up being pushovers. Like, I already beat Lance's level 60 Dragonite. Really? You think your level 52 Raticate's gonna do anything to me? I'm the champion, man. And then, sometimes there will be like a super-powered final boss with Pokemon in the 70s or even 80s, but like, I've only fought trainers in their 50s until now, so why the sudden spike? Shows that these games weren't perfect either. But even with those flaws, these games did excel at exploration. So what makes these extra areas stand out as memorable exploration from a player's standpoint? 1, they make the world feel larger without disrupting the gameplay progression. 2, they give the player a goal outside of the main goal of the game. And 3, they have certain Pokemon that are only available in these locations. Usually a legendary or something more unique. Chapter 2. How the jump to 3D hurt exploration. Pokemon X and Y were the first 3D games, and while they definitely still had a lot of exploration elements consistent with its predecessors, if you compare X and Y's extra locations with the ones from previous games, you can see that exploration took a bit of a hit in this game. While X and Y still uses the same kind of grid-like movement that a 2D game would, it's possible that the development restrictions based around 3D-ifying every part of the map made it much harder to create new maps, leading to the developers prioritizing only places that were 100% necessary to the main game's run. The only extra exploration locations I can think of off the top of my head are the cave where you get Zygarde and the forest that leads to the Pokemon village where you get Mewtwo. And while these are optional post-game locations, since they both contain legendaries that absolutely needed to be included in the game, they were obviously also required to be in the game just as a main story location would be. It's clear they didn't add anything extra. This makes Kalos feel much smaller, makes it feel like you're only on your one main quest, and doesn't give you the same connection to some of your Pokemon, as none of them are tied to extra exploration. X and Y also had just about no postgame. Like, sure, you could fight forever in the Battle Mason, gather all the Mega Stones, and try to find the legendary birds who roam around the region, but notice how all of these things involve the already established region, not a new area? And can we address how, as consumers, what a bad trade-off this is? So you get a game with 3D models, but because 3D models take so much more development effort, you get less exploration, less gameplay? Wouldn't it just be better to keep using 2D sprites then? It's really unfortunate, but it's not entirely the Pokemon developers' fault. After all, you kinda can't get away with making games that look like this anymore, as they won't be taken seriously by a broader audience. They all have to be 3D now. It's like, ooh, games with 3D models are more realistic, and I don't want realistic, I want good gameplay. And the 2D games were just more conducive to more engaging, more enjoyable gameplay. Not entirely the Pokemon developers' fault that it has to be this way. It's more of a problem with the broader perception of video games as an artistic medium. A problem that I think might be getting better, by the way, but only time will tell. So, from Sun and Moon onward, Pokemon completely ditched the grid-like designs of its previous games in exchange for a more traditional kind of player movement and map design. While this helped with game immersion, as 3D plus grid-like design isn't a great combo, these kinds of maps are even less conducive to deeper exploration than before. With a big 3D map, I just can't visualize and comprehend the whole thing, so it all just kind of feels like one big area. Whereas when it was grid-like, my brain could compartmentalize the adventure and have a better idea of how much I was exploring. I think it's no coincidence that these later generation games introduced fewer legendaries than the likes of Gens 3, 4, and 5. With such little exploration in these games, where would you even put all of them? I know the Ultra Beasts in Gen 7 are kind of an exception, but like, if you look at the way you caught them, they just kind of appear in previously established grasslands. You know, they don't have their own dungeons or nothing. Sun and Moon also tried to separate itself from previous games by removing gym badges, communicating to us that its structure would be different from the more grid-like games of old. However, while gym badges weren't present, the Totem Pokemon and Island Kahunas functionally took their place and didn't offer a meaningful subversion of the structure. When Sword and Shield introduced DLC, this helped a little bit with giving us just a tad more feeling of exploration and brought back the concept of a post-game that took you to a new area, except now you have to pay for it. The wild area in Sword and Shield completely missed the mark of trying to give us a sense of exploration, as, well, there was nothing to explore there. It was just a big giant area with a bunch of seemingly random Pokemon. And the DLCs basically introduced us to 2 other big wild areas, but, you know, it was something. There were more legendaries, a few new discoveries. It was a step in the right direction. Still a far cry from what we had on a Game Boy Advance, but something. I feel very similarly towards Scarlet and Violet as well, because it was basically just Sword and Shield wild area, but the whole game. If anything, the parts of Sword and Shield that I enjoyed the most were the non-wild area parts of it, because at least those felt close to exploration, whereas Scarlet and Violet, it's just the whole big empty map with towns popping up every so often, so I kind of saw Scarlet and Violet as a bit of a downgrade, even though other elements of Scarlet and Violet were executed better. This is not to say that any of these are bad games. I actually can find enjoyment in all of them, but they do lack the exploration that the 2D games all had, and I think that it's one of the major reasons why I'm more likely to revisit the 2D games as opposed to 3D. Chapter 3. Could proper exploration return? Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were an absolute disappointment when it came to exploration. But how can you say that, you may ask? I mean, they were almost exactly the same as their originals, so they had all the same exploration. And yes, they did, and that was fun to revisit. But they didn't add anything new. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of the chibi art style map because it's just a cheap imitation of the superior pixel art of the originals, but at least the BDSP map design was conducive to having some more exploration. And after years of 3D games that didn't give us much exploration at all, there was so much potential here for the devs to create new places to explore, but nope. The new content basically begins and ends with these little rooms they added to the underground where you can get some Pokemon you couldn't get elsewhere, and the replacement to Pal Park where they crowbarred in all the non-Sinnoh legendaries from Gens 1, 2, and 3. This is not exploration, it's copy and pasting ways to add a few more Pokemon to your team, and the Pokemon that I get through these methods don't mean as much to me as the ones I got through exploration. As far as exploration goes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is completely identical to the originals, so in that case, why not just play the originals instead? But the existence of a game that looks like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl could be an indicator of a future Pokemon game that is structured in a way where we could finally get more proper exploration. Look, I get it's impossible at the moment to make a game that looks like the pixel art of 2D games of old, even though I really would want that more than anything. In the meantime, the chibi 3D art style is a compromise, and I'd be willing to take that compromise for the sake of getting a game with more exploration. Chapter 4. The exploration of Legends Arceus. While Pokémon Legends Arceus does capture a sense of exploration just by virtue of having you adventure through all these different biomes, it still mostly boils down to a big place with lots of Pokemon running around, similar to Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, but it is executed a little bit better. We still aren't getting those things like the Ruins of Alph or Old Chateau, but I think what makes Legends Arceus feel a little bit different is that it wasn't trying to be a typical Pokemon game. Like other 3D games like X and Y, Sword and Shield, Scarlet and Violet all have the badge structure, town structure, routes, and all that, and that structure was originally created for the 2D games I talked about earlier, and in a 2D game, that structure nurtured exploration, while in a 3D game, exploration doesn't shine as brightly. Since Pokémon Legends Arceus takes on a different kind of structure that ignores typical badge progression for the sake of encouraging you to catch different sorts of Pokémon, the feeling of exploration thrives within this world. It would have been a little improved if the game was one big connected world rather than many different big areas that are all separated on a world map, but overall, since the game freed itself from the pre-established structures, it finally succeeded at giving us the feeling of exploration in a 3D space. All it needed was a little more emphasis on certain spots, and it would have been perfect. Chapter 5. Hey, wasn't this video supposed to be about Legends Z-A? And this finally brings me to Pokémon Legends Z-A. Remember that game I talked about in the intro a long time ago? So Pokémon Legends Z-A did something that no other Pokémon game has ever done before. They set the entire game in one city. So obviously, since the entire game takes place in one city, it's gonna be a pretty big city. And it is. And they have lots of areas where you can catch Pokemon and you can go on top of buildings to find items, and like, that's exploration. Sorta. Not like the kind of exploration I described earlier, but you explore. So while I think it's disappointing that Legends Z-A lacks the kind of exploration that was in the 2D games, I can at the very least respect it for understanding the kind of game it is, and how exploration wasn't its priority. Like, to compare it to Scarlet and Violet, which is just a game that's using the structure that was foundational to the 2D games and just not executing it properly in an attempt to feel open world, Legends Z-A, by throwing out that structure, is a lot more focused on what it actually wants to be. But was Legends Z-A's structure and lack of exploration necessary? Did the game need to completely forego exploration in order to be this kind of game? In some ways, I would say yes. The concept of battle zones in the city is something that would really only make sense if the game took place entirely within an urban area. However, looking a little more broadly, if the city itself had just a little more exploration to it, like maybe some more undeveloped areas, underground areas, and some kind of haunted abandoned house, we could have still had exploration in tandem with the structure this game was going for. It seems that the only reason I find myself missing exploration in Legends Z-A is because older games had it. But if you look at Z-A on its own, it does feel pretty complete, even without said exploration. A lot of the problems with level progression that Johto had, not present there. It feels good, it feels tight. This is not the same as how I feel about games like X and Y, Sun and Moon, Sword and Shield, and Scarlet and Violet, where I feel like all of those games have something missing with their smaller emphasis on exploration. And I think I feel that way about those games because they didn't fully separate themselves from exploration-based game design, whereas ZA structures itself so differently. While more exploration would have been appreciated, it didn't feel as necessary. On the other hand, I can see why one would expect every Pokemon game to have exploration, simply due to the fact that the franchise has been built on the idea of exploration for all these years. So when Legends Z-A deviates from that expectation, it feels weird. A game can take place in one city. Weird example, but think of like Grand Theft Auto. You know, those games just have you drive around in one city doing missions and whatnot, but I think that when we play a GTA game, we already have that expectation for how it's going to be structured. Whereas with Pokemon, we have a different expectation. It's an adventure-based game. I think the main problem with the lack of exploration in Pokémon Legends Z-A is that the game's new structure didn't stand out enough to meaningfully replace it. This brings me, finally, to what I talked about at the beginning of this video, the ZA rank-up structure, the thing that basically replaced exploration. So the ZA rank-up structure gives the player a pretty interesting gameplay loop. During the daytime, you go around and catch Pokemon and do quests and whatnot, and then when night falls, you do your trainer battles, and provided you get enough tickets, you do the boss battle against the lettered opponent and rank up. When this concept was introduced at Rank Z, I had an expectation that I would go through the gameplay loop 26 times, with probably a few story beats in between. And this expectation mostly turned out to be my experience, except, well, you only do the gameplay loop 11 times, not 26. Now, maybe this was for the best. After all, perhaps if this gameplay looped 26 times, it would have made the game a complete slog. But to that I say, why base your progression system on the 26 letters of the alphabet if you knew 26 was too many ranks? How about shape ranks, number ranks from 10 to 1, ranks represented by Pokemon? Like lowest rank is Rattata rank and highest is Zygarde rank or whatever? You know, you shouldn't set my expectation to be one thing and then not follow through on it. I think that is primarily where the Pokémon Legends Z-A developers failed. They failed to properly tie together what their audience would be expecting and what their audience would be experiencing, and that, I think, is the real source of a lot of our disappointments with the game. When it comes to audience expectation, there are a lot of things that are out of the control of the creator of a given property. Like I said earlier, we all expect Pokemon games to have exploration because every Pokemon game has some sort of exploration, and this is a perception that is not in the control of the developers of Legends Z-A. But just because they can't control it doesn't mean they aren't responsible for it. What the developers of Z-A should have done was understand what player expectation would be and use the game's marketing and the game itself to deeply communicate to the player that this is not the same kind of game as usual. In some ways, they did that, emphasizing in their marketing the use of Lumio City as the main setting, the battle system, and the fact of it being called Z-A as a reference to the battling rank system. But at the same time, I think they were a little afraid to really lean into all this. They could have framed the game as taking place in one city and having this new battle system as a major positive, as this new revitalized way of playing a Pokemon game, but they just kinda didn't. So with them not properly setting the expectation of what kind of Pokemon game this is, I can't really blame the consumer with being disappointed that their expectation was not met. I am still overall enjoying Pokemon Legends Z-A for all of its flaws. I do think there's a lot of things that could have made it better beyond even exploration stuff, but overall it is a pretty solid Pokemon experience. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, or you can become a channel member. Also, check out my other channel that covers movies and TV shows. I've got some videos about the Pokemon anime over there. You should really check it out.